Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Geibel, and welcome to this panel on this webinar on a pathway for HIV cure, introducing target product profiles and HCAAP. I have a great panel tonight, well, for me this morning, and we're really looking forward to it. Before we start, let me give a few housekeeping notes. Please note that due to the number of attendees, if you could please mute yourself, that would be appreciated. Feel free to send your questions that you may have for our speakers at any time through the QA box, which I assume this far into the pandemic, most of you know how to do. You'll also notice there's a thumbs up symbol when someone will ask a question in the QA box. If you have similar questions or find this question important, please click on the thumbs up sign to help us prioritize the questions. In case you're having any issues with Zoom, you can find additional guidance in the chat box. Please also send any technical questions you have in through the chat box. We have planned 40 minutes of Q&A after the presentation for our speakers. I'll be giving some of the questions, but we'll be checking the Q&A box to pull in some from you, so we have your engagement as much as possible, which really we're most interested in. And please finally try to focus your questions on today's topic. There are lots of interesting topics related to HIV cure, some of which we might be able to pull in, but let's try to stay focused on today's comments because we'll be having other sessions related to HIV cure. With that, it's my great privilege to introduce Sharon Lewin for opening remarks. It's rather early in the morning in Australia, so these are pre-recorded. As most of you know, Shannon is an infectious disease doctor and basic scientist with 25 years of experience in HIV-related clinical medicine and research. She's the director of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity, and also a full professor there, holding a named chair. She's president-elect of IAS and co-chair of the IAS Towards a Cure HIV program, and we're co-chair of that working group, which Steve Deeks is also on, one of our panelists. She's just an all-around awesome person, so we're delighted to have her opening comments. She's really been a leader in HIV cure from day one, so it's great to have her recorded message. So Ricardo, if you could play the opening from Sharon.
Good afternoon and evening, good morning, wherever you're dialing in for. My name is Sharon Lewin. I'm the director of the Doherty Institute at the University of Melbourne in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm very sorry I can't join you for this webinar today, Paving the Way for an HIV Cure. Unfortunately, it's the middle of the night in Australia and I draw the line at speaking after midnight. I'm delighted though to provide a few words of introduction as the co-chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for the Towards an HIV Cure initiative at the IAS. So I'd start with a short history of the initiative. This started in 2010 when Francoise Barrot-Sinoussi was the IAS president-elect and saw the great need for scientific leadership in work towards an HIV cure. The first workshop for the International AIDS Conference in Vienna was convened by Francoise, and this was shortly followed by the publication of a global scientific strategy in 2012. 2016, we published the second global scientific strategy in Nature Medicine, and actually currently working on our next global scientific strategy, which will be published, we hope, in 2020. However, along with these activities and arranging an annual conference for HIV cure science, the IAS became very involved in a very interesting initiative early last year. It was a meeting at Sunnylands, a retreat in Palm Springs, in fact, owned by the Annenberg family. And the Annenberg Trust at Sunnylands hosts small meetings where big topics and big challenges can be discussed and hopefully solved. The topic of that Annenberg hosted meeting was how we would accelerate and deliver an HIV cure. Even though we may not have a cure available currently, we need to perhaps think about it now and pave the way that it could be rolled out quite quickly. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about why we think this is important and why now. But the Sutherland's meeting did result in two important publications that came out on World AIDS Day this year. One, the target product profile for an HIV cure, and you'll hear more about that from Steve Deeks in this webinar. And the other is a new initiative called the HIV Cure Acceleration for Africa Partnership, or HCAAP. And you'll hear more about that from Mark Dybel later in the webinar. So I think it's important as a community to think why in 2020 we need an HIV cure. First of all, I think it's important to realise that there are challenges with current treatment and prevention. There's barriers to ART access and adherence. Many people report a poor quality of life on antiretroviral therapy. Primary prevention and incident reduction efforts are falling short of our targets, and we know that stigma and discrimination still exist in many parts of the world. The long-term stability of existing HIV/AIDS programs is uncertain. We have a youth bulge, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and there are significant challenges of long-term treatment, particularly in adolescents. Global funding for HIV is plateauing. Domestic funding might be increasing, but it's insufficient. And COVID-19 is really altering the funding and advocacy landscape. It's stretching resources and systems, and many parts of the world are reporting difficulty in access and adherence to ART. I think COVID-19 is highlighting to us that long-term sustainable ART for everyone is actually quite fragile. And finally, if we were to be successful for an HIV cure, this could have significant impact on other aspects of HIV care and prevention. It would certainly free up global and domestic health resources for other priority issues, but could also serve to strengthen cross-cutting services, infrastructure, information systems, and human resources within existing HIV programs. So what does the current and future landscape for HIV treatment and cure look like? Well, here we are in late 2020 with antiretroviral therapy available to 26 million people, 13 million people still not accessing treatment. In the next year or two, we are almost certain to see the availability of long-acting ART, which will be very beneficial for some people living with HIV. Either injectable antiretroviral therapy that could be given every month or 2 months, or even as an implant given every 6 months. And the possibility of broadly neutralising antibodies as treatments is also looking very real. These antibodies could also be given intermittently up to about 6 months apart. Looking towards what cure modalities we might see, it's possible that the first cure modalities we see come to the clinic fit under the umbrella of what we call combination immunotherapy, a combination of different strategies to target the virus and target the immune system. There's a lot of hope around gene and cellular therapy, which is currently ex vivo, meaning the manipulation occurs outside the body. But ultimately, and there are advances in these areas, in vivo cures may well be available, such as in vivo gene therapy. And the overall goal is ultimately to get a single shot cure. We're many, many decades away from that, but this is where we ultimately would like to be. Where are we now with an HIV cure? Well, combination immunotherapy, strategies to reduce infected cells and also boost immunity, can actually lead to cures, and we've seen that in monkey models, not yet in human clinical trials. Gene therapy to delete CCR5 and therefore protect cells from infection and or boost immunity, such as through CAR T cells or enhancing antibody production, and also targeting the HIV with gene therapy is all been shown to be quite feasible in both animal models and in some small human trials. Larger trials and efficacy studies are still needed. And finally, we're about to enter an era where there's a large number of randomized clinical trials of combination immunotherapy with an ART interruption to see if this actually has an effect on rebounding virus are underway. These are studies that have up to 60, 70 people involved, and they'll be complete in the next 2 to 3 years and will be very informative. But why talk about implementation of a cure now? You might be asking, is it too early to even contemplate that? Well, I think it's very much the view of the group that met at Sunnylands is that we don't want to repeat history. where implementation of treatments were delayed to the people that need them. We saw this with antiretroviral therapy, almost a 10-year delay between antiretroviral therapy being available in high and low income countries. And we're seeing it right now with PrEP. The efficacy of PrEP was demonstrated about 10 years before access to PrEP was really widespread in many countries. And there's many other examples of these sorts of delays in non-HIV fields, such as the HPV vaccination, meningococcal vaccination, and others. We don't want to repeat history where interventions that ultimately work are not feasible or accessible. A great example of this is tafenoquine, an anti-malarial drug that can only be used with a companion diagnostic test to look for G6PD deficiency. This greatly slowed down access to tafenoquine in low middle income countries. And a great example of access or uptake of vaccination is told with the smallpox vaccine delivery program, where syringes to many people look like guns, and therefore that really had an impact on uptake of vaccination. We need to know now from communities what's feasible, what's acceptable, and what will make access to this really, really easy. However, one major caveat that preparing for implementation of an HIV cure now must not limit innovation or future funding. We can see here that funding for cure research has been increasing over the last few years, but certainly plateauing. And really the major funder still remains the US. So we need far greater advocacy to increase funding in every other country for cure research, as well as ongoing engagement and collaboration with the private sector. I'd like to acknowledge the collaboration for this whole exercise between the IAS, the Annenberg Retreat at Sunnylands, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and hoping that the webinar is of high interest to all of you and generates much questions and dialogue. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Sharon. Really appreciate it, especially beaming in from Australia. And thanks for that outstanding summary and for all the leadership and work you've done to get us where we are. Now we're going to turn to one of the more exciting parts of this. You know, IAS is focused on young people. As Sharon just pointed out, it's going to be a while before we have cures, and it's really going to be the next generation of leaders that carries this all forward. Josephine Nabukenya will be speaking with us. She's an IAS governing member council and HIV cure advocate from Uganda. She's currently working at Makerere University, Johns Hopkins University Research Collaborative as a youth program coordinator for psychosocial activities. She's also an advocacy for cure grantee, and her project aim is to provide accurate information about HIV cure strategies to youth through on-site training and social media tools. So we're really privileged to have Josephine with us. So over to you now, Josephine.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Roseanne, for sharing my slides. I'll go into the reason as to why I'm here. And I'm here because as we pave the way for an HIV cure, we need to communicate to our community about an HIV cure. Most times we have the scientific language, but few of us will understand the scientific language. The majority of the population will need to get the community language. So my presentation is mainly about communicating HIV cure research in the community. Next slide, Roseanne. So what is community language? So I couldn't find one definition to really give to this term, but I found out that this is the use of words that can be understood by everyone. And everyone in the community, I mean the young people, I mean the illiterate, I also mean the adults, both those that have gone to school, but also those that have not gone to school. It involves ensuring that clear communication is done so that everyone will understand what has been said. And when we say clear communication, Definitely, from the definition that we all know from communication, it is the process of exchanging information to one person or a group of people using the most simple language and mode of delivery. So in the mode of delivery, you'll find that when you're talking to different categories of people, you may use different kinds of delivery modes to deliver this information. When I'm talking to young people, I may decide to use social media. But when I'm talking to the adults, I may not go on social media. So you need to know which language to use and then which mode of delivery that you're going to use. Next slide, Roseanne. So there are some words in HIV cure science that are very, very basic. When you start to Google or when you start to be on webinars like these, there are certain words that you will hear from day one or from the start until the end. And some of these words are in the scientific arena, but we need to know that when we go out in our communities, we will not have to say out these words the way they're being said by the doctors, by the scientists. We need to simplify these words so that our community can understand what we mean. And one of them is the CD4. We all know CD4. So when you go to the community, you may not say CD4. I even don't know the exact name of CD4 in full because I usually call it CD4, CD4. But when you go to the community, body soldiers will make more meaning. People will understand when you say your body soldiers than when you say CD4 cells. The other word is latency. So we all know that when you get HIV, HIV can go into some cells and it will hide there. And ARVs cannot approach such cells. So instead of going to the community and then you're saying latency, latency, it is always better if you use sleep mode. So when you say cells that are sleeping, not dead, but they have HIV, the community will clearly understand that. The other word are the receptors. So we all have cells, and these cells have what we call the doors, what the scientists call the receptors. So there is a specific receptor, CCR5, that opens, that allows HIV to get into the cell. However, certain people have a mutation, like they have cells that receptors that have CCR5 delta 32. So such receptors do not allow HIV to get into the cell. So when you go to the community, instead of saying receptors, CCR5 delta 32, you can simplify it to, instead of saying receptors, you say cell doors. Instead of saying CCR5, you say open cell doors that allow HIV to get inside. Instead of saying CCR5 delta 32, you can say these are closed cell doors that do not allow HIV to get into. People will visualize and understand that clearly instead of saying CCR5 and CCR5 delta 32. The other word, the reservoir sites. So HIV will get into certain parts of our body where ARVs cannot reach. It will be there and it will be active. So that is why even sometimes an HIV cure has been delayed because of such sites in our bodies. So instead of going to the community to explain reservoir sites, you would actually say HIV hiding places. So that a person will understand that actually when you get HIV, it will go and hide somewhere where the medication cannot reach. And lastly, the other word is the sanctuary sites. So these are similar to the reservoir sites. They are also restricted places. So instead of saying sanctuary sites in the community, you could use HIV restricted places. So why do we want to simplify this language? Why do we want to simplify these kinds of terms from the scientific world into the community world? We want to do this because we want to ensure that everyone understands what is happening around HIV cure. We want to do this so that we help in advocacy. I cannot advocate for something I do not understand. And for me to understand it, it should be in a very simplified language. The other reason is to help in community mobilization. We all know way back, people mobilized, people marched, people did so many things to ensure that they access ARVs. But the community cannot mobilize if they do not understand some of these scientific terms that are being used into HIV cure science. And the other thing is it will help in resource sharing among institutions and also advocates. We need to understand what is happening in all our different institutions so that if I have a need, I can be able to go into the institution and it will be able to help me. For example, we know that some institutions are doing QR studies and they have very heavy machines. So instead of running a QR study and I need the same machine, I may not be able to purchase that machine. But when I know that different institutions are having different QR studies and they have different kind of machines, then I'm in a position to go there and access the same service. Next slide, Roseanne. Yes, so now we are going to watch an animated video. Thanks to the grant I received, we're able to design these videos. And from this video, we'll be able to understand some of the strategies that are being researched about, and also understand the myths and misconceptions and why these myths and misconceptions do exist. Thank you, Roseanne. You can play the video.
Is it true that some people have the cure and are hiding it?
Uncle Bob testified that he was healed after being prayed for during last month's night prayer service.
A guy at home told me that virgins cure HIV, that if I have sex with him, he would be cured.
A pharmacist told me that for them, as a pharmacy, they preferred treatment to cure, and that pygmies cured HIV.
Friends, all these are myths and misconceptions. Just like any other illness, people usually come up with myths and misconceptions. These myths and misconceptions exist because 1, the search for an HIV cure is taking longer than expected. 2, the 2 individuals cured have come from different countries. 3, there is limited information about HIV research happening in the community. 4, different people respond differently when they stop taking ARVs. Then also, we need the cure because 1, ARVs are available but not easy to get for everyone. 2, adherence has a million challenges attached to it, yet you need to adhere well to ARVs in order for them to work for you. 3, ARVs are very expensive. Access to different regimens can be difficult, especially if you are already on third line or salvage line therapy. And finally, HIV has a lot of stigma related to it, both externally and internally. Now, let me tell you about some of the strategies being researched, and I will start with shock and kill. When a cell that has HIV is in sleep mode, ARVs are not effective because they cannot see HIV in the cell. This strategy, therefore, aims at shocking all the sleeping cells to produce HIV using different shocking agents that are being researched. These shocking agents wake up the cells to start producing the virus. The body and ARVs are then able to identify them and kill the virus. Gene therapy or the stem cell transplant. Research in this strategy is working on 2 different ways to cure HIV. We all have DNA. It's what works out everything in our bodies, from making protein to where our hair grows. These are the normal body soldiers that everyone has. Researchers are making body soldiers that can better recognize and attack HIV more effectively by changing DNA codes. About 1% of the global population have a change in their DNA that does not code for the CCR5 dose. They happen to be naturally immune to HIV. HIV uses a specific door called CCR5 to get into a cell. Researchers modify DNA to make cells resistant to HIV, similar to the Baleen patient Timothy Brown. Lastly, immune modulation or influence. This strategy looks at improving the person's immunity to be in the best position to fight HIV. HIV hides in different places that have restricted access, for example, the eyes. So researchers are strengthening the immune system to create body soldiers that can enter these restricted places, identify HIV in sleeping cells, and destroy it so that it does not come back in the bloodstream and attack the person again. Finally, researchers are also exploring broadly neutralizing antibodies as part of an HIV cure method. They can be used as the kill agent in the shock and kill approach, or be given to a person who has had their HIV hiding points reduced through some other methods. There are other strategies being researched. Some are too risky, expensive, and others have side effects attached to them. However, this is a great foundation to find an HIV cure that will be scalable to everyone with minimal side effects and cost friendly. For all people engaged in cure research, a treatment interruption in this case means that a person will be removed from taking ARVs for a monitored period of time to ensure that they are completely HIV free. You can only be declared HIV free if a number of tests have shown so while off treatment, but this can only happen under guidance and close supervision of highly qualified medical officials in a qualified hospital.
Thank you so much, Roseanne and Ricardo, for that. So, as we've heard from the animated video, that is one of the ways that we thought we can communicate HIV cure science to adolescents and young people through designing such videos and sharing them on different social media channels. So, besides the video, because we know that most people may not have access to smartphones or to gadgets, so we also designed illustrations that we have printed out and we are distributing in different healthy facilities. And that is one of the example of the illustration. So instead of having graphs and describing shock and kill strategy, we then devised other simpler ways of communicating some of these strategies. And before us, we have the shock and kill illustration strategy. So in here, we see that from the second image on your left, we are seeing cells that are dormant. And then when you proceed on the third image, which is the last image on your right, you'll see that there are some kinds of forces that have been placed onto these cells that were dormant. And when you go down here on your right, you see that the cells are now waking up. And after waking up, they are producing certain things. And what they're producing is what we are calling the HIV. And then lastly, we see that there is something ready in your bloodstream to actually attack and kill the HIV. So instead of showing the graphs and explaining all these kinds of scientific images, we thought when you're communicating HIV cure science in the community, probably using such images would communicate the information more clear. Yes, Roseanne, you can proceed. So I want to hear from everyone who is online right now. We are talking about HIV cure, and this creates a lot of questions. This creates a lot of tension around, especially in such an era where we've had COVID and we are now talking about the COVID vaccine. So when we come here and we talk about HIV cure, I need to hear from you. When do you think this cure will be available to us all? Not only to some populations, but to the entire world. So you're going to go into some polling, and then you can select the time frame that you think works for you. And then if you do not mind, you can go into the Q&A. You can go into the chat and then give us a reason as to why you think the cure will be available either in 1 to 5 years, or 6 to 8 years, or 9 to 10 years, or 10 years plus. So please proceed with the polling, and then afterwards, we'll have Ricardo to give us the results. Thank you. We can get the results. Okay, I have 1 to 5 years, 13% of us, and then 6 to 8 years, I have 16.9%, that is around 17%. And then 9 to 10, 26%. And then 10 years plus, that is 44.2%. Okay, so I wish I can see the reasons as to why you think the cure will be available to us within this time frame. But I know as we go on, I will be able to get those reasons. So whichever answer we've given and whichever reason we have, I want to let you know that when we are talking about HIV cure in the community, it is always better not to give a specific time frame. And these are some of the reasons as to why it is very difficult to set a time frame for an HIV cure. Number one, it is the human anatomy. So the way our human bodies were designed makes it a little bit harder for an HIV cure to be available to us, because HIV gets into other places of our bodies where ARVs cannot reach. And that has been one of the reasons as to why the cure has delayed. So the way the body is designed is one way that limits us. So we cannot really set a time frame to cure. And then two, the way HIV itself is designed, the fact that it has the power to penetrate into the restricted areas of our body. It has the power to penetrate into the hiding places where it is very hard for any strategy or any medication or injection to actually penetrate in. That also makes it hard for us to determine when the cure will be available. And then number three, little involvement of community in HIV cure work. If I may ask you people, how many times do you talk about HIV cure during your session at the facilities? You find that sometimes some facilities even never talk about HIV cure. Communities don't know about what's happening around HIV cure. So because there is little involvement from the community, HIV cure has been delayed, so it is very hard for us to set a time frame for that. And then number three, little support from local governments, and from the slides that were shared with us earlier on, we've seen that one key country that really funds HIV cure work is US. So where are the other countries? Where are our countries as Africa? So that also limits us to set a time frame for an HIV cure. And then a limited funding, definitely anything will move forward if there is funding for it. So if there is limited funding for specifically HIV cure, trust me, the time frame will also be affected. And then unfavorable policies from the ARBs to support HIV cure studies. We all know that in all our countries, no study can happen if it has not been approved. So certain policies within our countries do not make it easy for HIV cure studies to take place, especially where there are discussions around treatment interruption. In this era where there is test and treat for a lifetime, it is hard to come with a cure study and then you interrupt treatment. And then lastly, we have little or no cure research conducted on all categories of people, because it will not be a cure if it is not for all of us. So if you find that there is little research among pregnant and breastfeeding mothers, if there is little research among children, those are things that may delay us to getting an HIV cure, or those are things that are making it very hard for us to put a time frame on when the cure will be available to us. So I want to conclude and say, next slide, Roseanne. I want to conclude and say that HIV cure information needs it needs to be more common within the community so that people can mobilize, people can advocate for it, and people can participate in catalyzing for a search for an HIV cure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josephine, for that outstanding session, showing us how important the IAS work to engage young people is. And a great link between Sharon's introduction and what we're going to shift to, which is an explanation of the TPP and HCAAP. I mean, as you've clearly been hitting, it's great to have scientific advance for efficacious products, but they're not effective unless human beings use them. And the time delay from when a product is introduced to the time it's used because of all the issues you raised, can be very long. And also the importance of young people being involved. It's great to see more than half of people think we'll have a cure in less than 10 years. But that means young people are going to have to come up with the solutions and implement them, because people like Steve and I are going to be hopefully retired by then. So thank you very much for engaging and for the excellent presentation. So now shifting to Steve Deeks, who's going to talk about target product profiles, one of the publications that Sharon spoke about. I think Steve's known to all of you. He's professor of medicine in residence at the University of California, San Francisco, and faculty member in the Division of Infectious Diseases at the Zuckerberg General Hospital, San Francisco General Hospital. He's one of the leaders in cure, has been pushing it since the beginning, and also does great research and clinical research on it. He's co-chair of the TPP working group, a great guy and good friend who I'm privileged to be working on some of the stuff with. So Steve, to you for target product profiles.
Thanks, Mark. Hard to follow up on that inspirational presentation from Josephine. Okay, well, I'm good to go. I'm just going to take a few minutes here and talk about the target product profile initiative that Sharon outlined real quickly. So just as a quick background and from a big picture perspective, the question that was posed to us in terms of trying to put this program together is, what will a cure need to do? What does the community want? And whether it's in 5 years or 10 years, I tend to be more closer to the 10-year timeline. Once we actually have something, what does it need to do? And then we could talk about the ideal cure, or we could talk about what's practical and feasible, but we should probably talk about both. And it certainly is easiest to talk about the ideal product profile, what a perfect intervention might be. And it would be something along these lines. It would be something that would be as effective as art. It's hard to be more effective than art when it's applied correctly. It would be safe. It would be globally accessible. There would be no limitations on where you can actually deliver it. It would be urban areas, rural areas, all around the world. It would be affordable. It would be well tolerated, and basically it'd be effective for decades. And importantly, it would work in everybody, not just people who are on long-term therapy, but people who are not on long-term therapy, because those are the people who actually are in the greatest need right now of something. So we want something that ultimately will work like a shot in the arm in people, whether they're on therapy or not. And importantly, and I won't get into this, public health modeling would suggest that the ideal cure would also prevent reinfection. And that ultimately would actually reduce the size of the reservoir. This is obviously aspirational. This is not going to be the first generation of cures, but trust me, I do think that there are viable pathways to get to something like this. And there's a lot of work in heading in this direction, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. All right, but that's the easy part, right? That's the characteristics of what a perfect cure will be. The question really on the table is what at a minimum will the affected communities, the key stakeholders, accept in terms of a cure 5, 10, 15 years from now, whenever we get there? And this has actually proven to be somewhat of a challenging discussion, and there's been a fair amount of debate. Let me go back a little bit here in history. Sharon talked about this in her presentation. About last year, the IAS, the Gates Foundation, and the Annenberg Foundation sponsored a retreat that occurred in Southern California. This is about a year and a half ago now. And we brought in key leaders from industry, academia, advocacy, the community, funders from all around the world, gathered for a 2 or 3 day meeting. We discussed issues in terms of long-term implementation. You'll hear about this with HCAAP, but also this issue of what a therapy that's going to be delivered needs to do. What is the product profile? What is the characteristics of it, the so-called target product profile? And we initiated those discussions. We agreed at that meeting that whatever product profile comes out should be applicable everywhere, and not just in rich countries, but basically something that could be used across the world, particularly in the areas where it's greatest need. The process was apparently standard in these types of exercises. I'm not an expert in TPPs. I'm still sort of struggling with some of the terminology, but once we decided what we needed, we actually reached out to various key stakeholders, leaders in industry and funders and community leaders, about 30 or so people, had a 30-minute deep dive interview, and then got a sort of a concept of where we want to go. And then we did an online Delphi exercise in which several hundred people were asked to comment on what we've done. And then we basically took all that information, had a consensus, and recently published everything in Lancet HIV. And the idea now is that this document, that this program will now live in HCAAP, which you'll hear about shortly. So a key point in the way we thought about this is that just like with antiretroviral drugs, we started off with AZT. Now we got the integrase inhibitors. It was an iterative process. We expect the same happen here. The first generation cures are not going to be ideal, but hopefully they'll have some impact. But the whole idea is that once we get things going, things will get better over time, as is natural. So just a couple of days ago in the Lancet HIV, the target product profile discussions for mainly for combination immunotherapies was published. What exactly was this? This is sort of an agreed upon set of minimally acceptable and the optimistic characteristics of what a product might be. And our goal really is to sort of align all the stakeholders, not just the academic, clinical investigators, industry and community people now, but the implementers and the regulators and the governments and mainly the communities around the world, so they can begin to have some input on what we're going to have, what we're going to deliver. I'm not going to go into details in terms of what we actually came up with. I'll talk about some of the key points, but this paper should be easily accessible online. And if not, you guys can reach out to me. I can share it pretty easily. All right. So what are some of the conclusions that we drew from this discussion? And I'm just going to throw it out there, and hopefully we'll have some debate when Mark moderates a discussion section. But there was general consensus that we didn't want this process to prevent innovation. We did not want to basically say up front that what we need is something that's going to be as good as treatment, that's going to be easy to deliver and so forth. We realize and we appreciate and we certainly support as a group that this first generation cures could be cumbersome. They might not be scalable. They may only work in tertiary cares in urban areas and so forth. And they may in fact be less effective than ART initially. And again, and this brings up what has been the most contentious issue. Will we accept something that's not as effective as ART? And my perspective, and I think perspective of many, but again, there is some debate. People who are doing well on ART right now may not necessarily need a cure. It's everybody else that could benefit. And so we want to make sure that products that are actually able to address some of these unmet needs could move forward. Again, I think we should discuss this a little bit later in our session. The sense is that we need to start somewhere, and the first generation cures will be a bit cumbersome, but we'll build on that. The process will be iterative and so forth. And the biggest debate and the stakeholders and the Delphi and some debates that have actually happened after the publication came out is will anybody, are we going to have a stringent outcome where basically we need complete and total control of the virus, or are we going to loosen up a little bit and allow for a product to move forward that may not be perfect, but certainly is better than what's happening now in that group of the world's population who just for whatever reason cannot tolerate antiretroviral drugs? And I think this is something we should discuss. But what was universally accepted was that whatever intervention that we got, the degree of virus control had to be below whatever that threshold is, and it may in fact be close to being undetectable, above which the virus can be transmitted. This was sort of a key issue in the discussions, that the goal really needed to have a public health perspective. And again, as I've discussed, there's been a lot of debate in terms of its safety issue. The idea being that ultimately we want something that's as safe as ART, if not safer, but we recognize that some of these early generation cures are not going to be necessarily safe. But what was really important that, and this came through loud and clear, that if there were side effects and they had to be manageable, they had to be short term, and there would be zero tolerance for really any significant risk for long-term toxicities from whatever curative intervention was administered. Something I hadn't thought about until we started was this issue of a biomarker. If you give a cure and you don't know if it works, then you have to stop therapy to figure that out. And stopping therapy in someone who may not be cured is a big deal. So if we have a biomarker that says, okay, this worked, we gave you this cure, it worked, you can stop therapy safely and the virus will not rebound, that would be extremely beneficial, much helper. So in addition to developing target product profiles for the strategies, we need to start thinking about how this stuff is going to be monitored, and particularly a biomarker for its success. And another, again, as a clinician in San Francisco dealing with the individuals for the most part, I don't often think about public health stuff, but it became quite clear through some modeling experiments and the opinions of others that ultimately, whatever we do is going to need to prevent reinfection. Otherwise, these cures will work on an individual level, but the epidemic will continue to spread. So I want to just acknowledge some of the key people from the retreat and the subsequent discussions on this slide. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides and send it back to you, Mark.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Great overview, and thanks for introducing some questions that we'll get to have more discussion on when we get to the QA session. Now I'm going to shift to Zuzu. Dr. Izuzu Sikazwe is the head of something called CIDRS, the Center for Infectious Disease Research in Zambia. She's been really a leader in HIV implementation, research from the very beginning in Zambia, and has done an amazing job. She's actually been co-chair of the HCAAP group, which I'm very honored to co-chair with her, and she brings tremendous perspective. So Zuzu, could you please present HCAAP, and then we'll have a moderated discussion.
Sure, thank you, Mark. I hope everybody can see my slides and can hear me okay. So I will be talking about HCAAP, which is the HIV Cure Africa Acceleration Partnership. So really making a case for an HIV cure and how to get there, essentially looking at it from an African perspective. So one of the things that has come up, and I've seen this in the Q&A box and the chat box, is about funding. And in my setting especially, there's always great concern in terms of how do we continue with having the required funding to keep our programs going. And looking at where our programs are right now, we've really implemented them. And my country, for instance, Zambia, is close to achieving has achieved actually the global 90-90-90 targets. And it's well on its way to making the 95-95-95 UNAIDS HIV targets. So how do we sustain these gains that we've made, given the changes in the funding landscape, the changes in our population, and the shifting health priorities, as well as addressing some of the natural and man-made calamities? A lot of the challenges we face in the recent past on the continent includes floods and droughts that have brought a lot of food insecurity amongst different populations. You may ask, why are we doing this? Why is this specific for Africa? We do know that across the world, there are populations that are affected with HIV, but why are we doing this for Africa? So you can see on my slide here is that even though we have 42 million individuals living, we anticipate having 42 million people living with HIV by 2030, the bulk of these will be from the African continent. Currently, sub-Saharan Africa only accounts for about 15% of the global population, but 68% of people living with HIV are actually from Africa. And in the last year or so, according to the records from UNAIDS, 57% of new infections were recorded from Africa. And we do know about the uncertainty or the concerns around long-term sustainability of funding. African countries did sign up to the Abuja Declaration almost 20 years ago. And with this declaration, they were supposed to assign or allocate at least 15% of the annual budgets towards health initiatives or health systems. But I can tell you that very few countries actually meet the Abuja Declaration even now. And my country, Zambia, has struggled to do that. So again, the issues of funding come into this space, and there are concerns on the ground from recipients of care, from providers, as well as our policymakers in terms of how do we continue to provide accessible and high quality HIV services given the other priorities that we're addressing. And of course, there are issues that have to do with how to address some of the gaps in the health system in Africa, given the competing health priorities. There is talk of COVID-19. We've been fortunate in terms of the modeling and the projections for African COVID-19 haven't panned out as the models had predicted. Otherwise, the strain on our health system would have been just unremarkable. So the problem essentially is that our existing healthcare systems are not able to cope with the challenge at hand. And it's important to recognize that no single industry or entity or agency will be able to both develop the HIV cure as well as ensure that it gets the population that needs it. The thing to remember is that an intervention is only as good as its reach and its adoption within the population that it's supposed to be targeting or having an effect with. Even though we've made strides in terms of improving the linkages between regulatory frameworks and policymakers as well as community, not enough has been done and these gaps still remain. And therefore this calls for greater private and public collaboration in the research efforts. I've talked about how Africa has faced such a disproportionate burden of the disease, and it's critical that we work to close these gaps and work towards introducing a product that will be acceptable within our communities, acceptable and easily taken up and taken to scale. Steve had talked about how this will be different, especially in the beginning. So while we're hopeful for a one-shot cure, we do acknowledge that this may not be possible right off the bat. Sharon had talked about this very briefly in her presentation, but I wanted to bring home that there are lessons that we can learn even within our HIV space. And I share here the timeline with PrEP. That's the pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV. And clinical trials for PrEP really began, close to 15 years ago, if not longer. And we had really good evidence to show that Truvada works to prevent HIV infection from the different clinical trials that published this data between 2010 and 2011. And by 2012, the US FDA had approved Truvada for use as to prevent HIV infection. And WHO, which countries, especially here on the continent, really follow through and listen to in terms of shaping national policies and guidelines, did issue guidance on the use of PrEP for discordant couples, transgender women and men, and those who have sex, and men who have sex with other men, all in a bid to prevent new HIV infection. But you can see here on this timeline that Zambia just integrated these guidelines into its national policy in 2016. And looking at the 2020 target for PrEP from UNAIDS and the achievement thus far, you can see we're really way off the target. We haven't been able to utilize this remarkable innovation to its fullest capacity. Part of the challenges has been that there's little data on PrEP uptake versus the target. In my country, our target for PrEP has been unclear because we do not have a good understanding of the population at risk and who would be able to take PrEP. There's also limited awareness and willingness to take the intervention. I think part of it is the lack of engagement with community, with the recipients of the product right early on to make sure that we get their perspectives in terms of how they'll be able to utilize this intervention. Again, the products can only be as effective as their reach and adoption. So when it comes to HCAAP, and some of this history has been talked about, so I won't belabor the point, but just to really stress that at the bottom there, 2020, we've come to a point where we're launching HCAAP. We have published the HCAAP paper that really gives the nuances behind the work that we've done. And this is in the Lancet HIV, and I'll try and share the link in the chat box after my presentation for those that are interested. But essentially what HCAAP is all about is grounded in our theory of change, which is to create a platform to promote the dialogue among key stakeholders to accelerate the availability and delivery of HIV cure on the African continent. And we recognize that we have different stakeholders, but at the center of this, especially for HCAAP, is being able to bring people living with HIV and those affected by HIV and their communities into the dialogue, making sure that their voices are heard and they inform the process of not only the product that Steve talked about, but the actual implementation of this product or the rollout of the product to the public. And how do we intend to achieve our vision? So again, is to inform the product development in terms of its actual process development, its access, and the rollout through a coordinated stakeholder insight and evaluation. And then also drive the collaboration between cure stakeholders while actively identifying other partners that may be missing from this table and bringing them on board. And our vision is really to accelerate progress towards a cure that can be implemented on the African continent. On this slide is a broad examples of some of the stakeholders that we've engaged with. But at the center of the slide, again, you will see is that we keeping people living with HIV, those affected by HIV, and their communities right at the center of what we're doing, making sure that their voices and their thoughts and perspectives are incorporated in terms of our cure strategy. And whether this will be in the next 5 years or 10 or 15 years, but really making sure that they're part of the process. We have the HCAAP Secretariat, as well as a board and working group members. And then on the outer side, on the outer circle, you will see our different stakeholders. And these are both from the African continent and the global sphere in terms of other partners that we've worked with. We have philanthropy, we have research organization, we have pharma, both those that are originators and those that manufacture the generics that we utilize a lot of here in Africa, as well as key international organizations such as UNAIDS. And not forgetting the regulators. The regulators are really critical to this process, and being able to work with them to understand some of their concerns that they may have with the products or the rollout or the implementation science around the rollout, bringing them on board and getting their feedback is critical. So the HCAAP roadmap to a cure keeps our vision and our vision pathway right at the top. We are looking towards having a single shot cure, but we're open to we're open and acknowledging that we're not going to get there right away, and we'll have to go through several different cure modalities prior to getting to the single shot cure. And again, our goals are to accelerate the development and influence the design of the cure products, and to engage the relevant stakeholders into the discussion. We have three main objectives, and one is to facilitate collaboration between a multidisciplinary group of stakeholders, and then also ensuring that people living with HIV and the communities, particularly those from resource-limited settings, participate in the dialogue, and then establish forward-thinking and a flexible platform that is able to connect all the stakeholders, and that is managed by a sustainable secretariat. Finally, the long-term vision, again, it comes back to the community. I think we will not be able to achieve what the vision is for HCAAP if we do not keep the community, those living with HIV or affected by HIV or providing services for HIV clients around the center of this dialogue, and making sure that that voice is heard by all the relevant stakeholders. We're looking to convene people living with HIV and the broader community in the education, working with some of the community communication that was presented earlier on. It's really interesting, and it breaks down a lot of the complicated information that we tend to use in the scientific world, which may not be applicable when we engage more with community. Then we want to prompt the efforts to extend the reach of limited financial advocacy and workforce resources for HIV cure, and really drawing on underutilized communities and stakeholders to lead this response. For us, we also want to leverage this platform to support inclusive dialogue for innovations beyond HIV, being able to see how we can transfer what we've learned through this process to other health priorities, emerging diseases, or how to deliver products to communities. So be able to provide actionable best practices to a broader community. And we anticipate that whatever we learn with HCAAP, we'll be able to share with other countries in LMICs that are not in Africa, because there are certain aspects of their HIV programming or their epidemic that may be similar with different aspects that we're seeing here on the African continent. So there will be lessons that they can pick up and make applicable to themselves, including those in resourced countries. I want to end by saying that I've seen colleagues that I've worked with here at CIDES in Zambia taking the lessons from our HIV testing and contact tracing, as well as our TB contact tracing, and applying those lessons and setting up the COVID contact tracing there in the US. So there's a lot of lessons that we have here in Africa, best practices that are applicable to resource-rich countries as well. I want to end by acknowledging the different collaborators and individuals that we've engaged with in this process. Mark, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Zuzu, for that great overview of HCAAP. And now I think we can have an open conversation, and some questions have come in. Actually, Zuzu, I think you dealt with one of them. One of them was on, is cost something to consider in TPP? And of course, the whole purpose of HCAAP is to bring people together to ensure that whatever is produced is available for people in Africa, which would include cost issues. Steve, a couple of questions have come in, and it kind of links to Zuzu's presentation as well, on how many people living with HIV or people from the communities were involved in the formation of the TPP. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the pretty extensive process you all undertook, both with online surveys, but in-person consultations such as ICASA. And then Zuzu, maybe you can talk a little bit about the intent and how to bring people living with HIV, and specifically community groups in Africa, into HCAAP in the long term. So Steve, why don't we start with you to give people a sense of how extensive the process was and the deep engagement.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I don't have the details, and Roseanne might actually, if she wants to contribute to this a little bit, but so this all started this meeting in Sunnyland meeting back in 2019, and we had community advocates there. Moses Supercharger, who I believe is on the Zoom meeting today, ended the meeting, as I recall, with a very passionate discussion of why we need a cure. And it had a huge impact on a lot of the people at that meeting, who were actually quite far from the front lines. I mean, we invited a lot of high-level government type people, so that was very impactful. Then, I think of the 30 or so people who were stakeholders, key, like 4 or 5 of them were sort of community advocates. And then, as I recall from the Delphi exercise, we sent out several hundred invitations. A big chunk were to people who were engaged at various levels in terms of advocating or supporting or educating the community. But I actually don't have the numbers.
Okay.
But I do recall that their input was actually often quite passionate and probably had a bigger impact than other stakeholder groups.
And I would just add, at ICASA, which for those of you who don't know is the African infectious disease meeting held every 3 years, is it? Something like that. In Kigali, we had a session which was probably 80% of several hundred people, which is probably 80% community groups and representatives from the community, people living with HIV were very vocal. That input was also brought into the TPP, and then there were several other sessions at IAS and other places where there was deep community engagement. Zuzu, do you want to talk a little bit about the vision for HCAAP and bringing people in? I can supplement that as well since we do it together.
Yeah, sure. So with community, we do have community representation, like you said, within the HCAAP working group. And what we've tried to do is have them engage with their networks, civil society groups, or community-based organizations, and start to talk about HCAAP and the path towards an HIV cure. And work such as Josephine is doing is critical in terms of helping us, break down this language into a format that is easily understandable by our community. For instance, here in Zambia, we do have an HIV cure WhatsApp group where we have different community members posting or chatting about their thoughts around an HIV cure. So it's really being led by country groups across the continent. Over.
Thanks, Zuzu. And HCAAP is in its earliest stages, and we actually want it to be shaped by the entire value chain that Zuzu showed, from R&D into the community. And importantly, so the community also can feed back to the R&D community on what kinds of products would move quickly in their communities, and to help design, similar to the example that Sharon showed with the implement to vaccinate for smallpox, and had people talk to the community at the beginning, it probably wouldn't have been shaped like a gun to begin with. And so that two-way conversation is actually the vision of HCAAP, but we're just getting started. There's a question from someone about doing HIV cure work in Africa, how to get in touch with us. For now, the best way to do it would probably be to send Zuzu and myself a note as co-chairs, and Lauren Mathey. Roseanne's also involved, so if you send us your contact information, we can get to you. But again, we're just in the earliest stages. We're trying to raise resources to stand it up. But just to emphasize the vision, and for Steve, from what Steve said, I can tell you the pharmaceutical companies, the policymakers from Africa who attended, from ministries of health, all had the exact same reaction, which is communities are the most important. That's where we fall down with the introduction of new products. We think that we can just bring them in and everyone's going to accept them and take them, but that actually is not the case, and you have to involve communities early and often, and that's why we think it's early to be involved now. And the example of where we are 10 years into demonstrated proof of PrEP and so little uptake is a good example of that. Couple more questions maybe, and I'll ask this one to you, Zuzu, and Josephine, you could please jump in on any of these as well. Where HCAAP is of course concentrated in Africa for the reasons you mentioned, because 2/3 of infections are there. And the youth bulge could actually significantly increase that. But would there be applicability for other low and middle income countries of what HCAAP does, or is it just Africa?
Sure, I think there is applicability to other LMICs. And like I said, we're concentrating on Africa because this is where the bulk of the disease is. But as we learn, I think there are lots of lessons that can be shared with other LMICs in other parts of the world. And they would also feed back into us what they think is a better approach in terms of how we're going about it. So I do see it as a bi-directional process. But ultimately, at least in my mind, I think if we can get a product that can be implemented in Africa, given how diverse it is in terms of the culture, the population, the geography, we should be able to have a product that could almost be delivered anywhere in the world. I don't know what Josephine thinks.
Thank you so much for that. I also think that it would also apply to other parts of the world. If we concentrate on Africa, the fact that we have the biggest burden, and as you've truly explained, the diversity in Africa will actually make it even acceptable in the other parts of the country. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And speaking as someone in the United States, we have 50 counties in the United States that account for 80% of new infections, which is about the same level of new infections we had 20 years ago. And they're in communities that we don't reach. They're in communities where there's high stigma and discrimination, especially against Black men who are gay, dually stigmatized because they're Black and gay, particularly in the South. And we have not really engaged in the communities and why this is occurring and how to get our way out of the high infection rates that we have, some of which are higher than the infection rates in Africa. So there are similarities to what we see in Africa in the United States. And so what we learned from HCAAP, while we're focused on Africa, could have wide applicability in other settings, particularly where stigma and discrimination is involved. And there's a comment already on, PrEP, the uptake with PrEP. A big issue is stigma and discrimination, which feeds back into all of the same issues that we've been talking about. Also, just to follow up, Roseanne was kind enough to provide some of the details of the, there were 200 people at ICASA, 80 to 90% of those people were people living with HIV/AIDS and from communities. Moses Supercharger gave a really not invigorating speech there, as he did in Sunnylands. From the Delphi exercise, Steve talked about 240 of the respondents were from the community, and all of that was shared with 500 additional stakeholders. So it is an area we're deeply focused on, and it's something IAS spends a lot of time focused on, as you can tell by having someone like Josephine involved. One of the other issues, and this has come up a little bit in the questions, and this is for all three of you. What can stakeholders expect from HCAAP in the next few months to years, since it's early going? And maybe any of you can ask from each of your perspective. And Steve, as you answer, maybe you could talk about how TPP and HCAAP will come together and evolve over time. So maybe we could start with you, Steve.
Yeah, so the TPP initiative basically, I think, is going to now transfer to become owned by the HCAAP, and there's still a lot of work to be done. The profiles that were published mainly focus in on sort of the immunotherapy approach, the combination stuff, vaccines, antibodies, and so forth, because that's where a lot of the energy has been over the past decade or so, and that's where most of the clinical trials are. But HCAAP and everybody involved in this initiative is well aware that over the next decade or so, there's going to be this massive amount of advances being made in gene therapy, cell-based therapy, including gene editing, and including in what I think Sharon or someone mentioned, so-called in vivo gene therapy, where it's, right now, if you do gene therapy, you got to take all sorts of stuff out of the body, send it to a lab, muck around with it, put it back in. That's expensive. That's not very scalable. But there's a lot of progress being made in terms of actually being able to inject something in the arm that will actually achieve the same thing. So I'm saying all that because I think actually once the TPP initiative lands in HCAAP, one of the big deliverables that we're going to have is to go out and do the same thing that we just did for immunotherapy with gene therapy. And the IAS is actually sponsoring a meeting on the future of gene therapy and its interactions with other fields. for HIV cure at the Berlin meeting next summer. And so as I speak now, I'm hoping that perhaps we can make some progress in developing a TPP for gene therapy through HCAAP before then.
Thanks, Steve. Josephine, anything you want to add about, and you haven't been deeply involved in HCAAP, but what you would see, particularly from a youth perspective, and how you'd like to, maybe how you'd like to see HCAAP engage with young people would be a good lead into Zuzu's answer.
Okay, so with HCAAP around focusing on Africa in the coming months or years to come, I see progress made in products that will fit our communities or our population. Several times products come to Africa, but in one move or the other, sometimes they cannot be administered in our communities. So with this available, I see that that challenge or those kinds of challenges are going to be dealt with. So we'll have we'll see progress in terms of having products, or in terms of doing interventions that will definitely fit within the African community.
Thanks. Zuzu?
Yeah, just to add to what's been said, I think, it's been early days for HCAAP. I know we started this process thinking through HCAAP and what it looks like sometime last year in January. And during that process, we did have community representation. And along the way, it's been a process of trying to bring them on board and thinking through with them what actually the strategy for Africa should be. But I think as we move along in the coming year is how to formally organize community teams or networks across the continent and have a more structured approach in getting their feedback. Because right now we kind of have pockets of community members that we interact with, and we've got valuable input from them, but then how do we structure and have a more cohesive approach to getting their input and making sure that it feeds into the process.
Yeah, thanks, Zuzu. And just to, as your co-chair, this is early days. The vision is to have this for the long term, of course, because it's going to be a while for cure, and to have it as a constant iterative process, to have communities, people living with HIV involved from the beginning, as we've been doing. And as Zuzu said, how to structure that. But we'd like not to predetermine what that structure looks like, but actually to evolve together, to learn together, to create a community of practice that we'll learn and grow together, because this will be over time. And importantly, as some have mentioned, to bring in lessons already from PrEP and other experiences that we've had, so that we're learning from the communities what they've experienced thus far. But it's early days. We don't even have the funding for it yet. So we'll move forward. Steve, one of the questions you foreshadowed, and maybe you can say a little bit more about, maybe with input from Josephine and Zuzu as well, on what is the justification for looking at cure approaches in the early days that could be less safe and effective than antiretroviral therapy? Because that, as you pointed out, that's something that for some people just doesn't connect.
Yeah, I started this business back in '93, right? And that was sort of a bad period, as those of you who are around remember. That's when we figured out that AZT really didn't do much except make people sick. So clearly we don't want to do that with this first generation, but without question, medicine is, the history of medicine is that you get these first products out there, proof of concept, and that inspires innovation, and it can happen quite rapidly. And innovation is not only in terms of the science that occurs, but the regulatory environments and the community uptake and so forth. And so, yeah, so we're initiating a study in a few months here in which we're going to take, leukapheresis, right? A really expensive procedure, and gene modify these cells to make them into super killer CD8 T cells, CAR T cell therapy, and infuse it back. There's no way that this is going to be immediately scalable. But there are people out there who are Mark and I are working with these guys, these teams that are sort of building these boxes that you could take blood from the arm of a person, put it in this box in a hospital, and it's gene therapy in a box and put it back in. And in 10 years, we're going to probably be using those types of approaches for cancer. So I'm all for developing HIV cures that are quite cumbersome, expensive now, because I am very confident that particularly in this area of biologics, the pace of innovation is going to be so great that once we get to the HIV cure part, yeah, the first approved products will be challenging, but then there'll be rapid innovation. In 93, we had AZT and it didn't work. In 96, we had AZT3TC and Indinavir, and it worked great. And that was 3 years. And since then, the pace of innovation and progress has been basically more or less steady and stable and impressive.
Thanks, Steve. It is a complicated area, but this is how we make strides. But it is for ongoing conversation. So thank you to those of you who raised it. A couple things just to note. There's a note from someone about the engagement of women in Africa. No question about it. Women are highly at risk, and we definitely want that type of engagement. Thank you for sharing your email address with us. Again, we're in early days, but we'll certainly follow up with you as things progress, because if we don't engage with women, we're missing half the sky, as some people say. There's a question basically back to Josephine on IRBs and policies, and could that be an area of advocacy? I'm not sure it's specific to Josephine, because it's not just young people that need to do it, but Josephine, if you want to say anything about that, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, there could be more. Yeah, there could be more policies that are limiting the intervention of cure studies, but one of them is the test and treat. We all know that for you to be cured, you'll be off treatment for some period of time, and it will be monitored by the health worker. So in most times, some cure studies have been limited in some countries because of the test and treat guidelines.